Day to begin our 2019 season here at the Bennington Museum. Of course, we're closed for the month of January, and that's so that we can bring you all of the exciting changes and new things that we are bringing to you today here in the beginning of February. I am going to be giving a slightly longer than maybe traditional introduction, only because I'm also going to be presenting something that might provide a little bit of insight into kind of a larger context for what Phil and Ryan will be talking about, and make no doubt they are the main program today. My name is Jamie Franklin, and I'm the curator here at the Bennington Museum, if I haven't already said that, excuse me. Phil came to me with this possibility, this opportunity to share what we feel is a really exciting tidbit that not many people know about the Battle of Bennington. Perhaps nobody, outside of a very small group of people who will now be those sharing it with you. But when he came to me, what was really exciting was we had just, as a matter of fact, acquired this portrait of Lieutenant Jonathan Holton, not a famous participant in the Battle of Bennington by any stretch of the imagination, but yes, he was here, yes, he fought, and he made a real sacrifice. As you can see in the portrait, it's a little difficult to see, and by the way, this is a lot bigger than it is in real life. This is a little thing. So there's a small, lovely installation of miniature portraits, early miniature portraits of many people who fought in the Battle of Bennington and other early settlers here in Bennington from the late 18th into the mid-19th century, which is in our early Vermont gallery. I encourage you to go and take a look. You can see the Holton portrait in person, as well as the tintype, which was taken of it in the mid-19th century, which is part of the larger story that I am about to tell you. And so when Phil came to me about this story of a black Green Mountain boy who had lost his life in the fighting for the cause of liberty during the Battle of Bennington and the Revolutionary War, I thought, what better way to kind of reveal this portrait and hear about the lesser known stories. Of course, the Bennington Museum was founded, depending on how you define founding, dating all the way back to the mid-19th century, and it was really founded as a way of preserving the history of the Battle of Bennington more than anything. It was really instrumental in the development and building of the Battle Monument right up on the hill, which of course was not the site of the Battle of Bennington. Excuse me, I just need to take a quick drink. But was where the British forces, mostly actually paid soldiers from the German states coming down from the north. So the whole kind of origins and beginnings of this institution is wrapped up in the Battle of Bennington, and it's very much integral to what we do as an institution in the past, and continues to be integral to what we do at this institution today. We have, as many of you who have been following the museum over the course of the last decade or so have seen, we've begun to expand our offerings into the 20th and 21st centuries with contemporary art, modern artists who were associated with Bennington College in the mid-20th century, but we continue to look at the full breadth of the historical, cultural, social, political history and background of Bennington, Bennington County, and Vermont as a whole, as well as the surrounding regions of upstate New York, of course, where the battle took place. And other nearby places like the Berkshires, where the soldier that we're going to be learning a lot about today, Sipp Ives, was from. And so we continue to publish scholarly articles on the Battle of Bennington in our Loomsack Review. Michael Gabriel, who's a professor from the University of Kutztown, I believe, or it's in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, publishes regular articles about little unknown tidbits about the Battle of Bennington in our Loomsack Review. And so it was really exciting when I came upon this portrait. History, and particularly the Revolutionary War era, is often a history of famous white men, leaders during that period. And probably no more famous Revolutionary War figure in this part of the world than Ethan Allen. Of course, Ethan Allen did not fight in the Battle of Bennington. I will be clear on that, but he's the name that most people are familiar with. Of course, Seth Warner was in charge of the Green Mountain Boys on that day, and some people know that name, but you know, Ethan Allen is this very famous person. But the funny thing is we don't have a lifetime portrait of him. We don't really know what Ethan Allen looked like. This is a composite that was created in the early 20th century, an artist's version of what he thought Ethan Allen might have looked like based on an in-depth study of his relatives, his descendants. So this is what the closest we can come to understanding what Ethan Allen, one of the most famous figures, particularly in this region of the country, associated with the Revolutionary War. But for me, I find little things like this more fascinating because they connect us to a person directly. So this is a tab for the Catamount Tavern, which is, of course, it was burnt down in 1877, but it's right over there at the intersection, the property behind the bronze catamount, which is on the large plinth. So this was a regular meeting place for Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. Ethan Allen actually lived across the street. And so he regularly met with his compatriots in the Green Mountain Boys and other important political figures. And, you know, this document is his bar tab. You see his name up at the top, Ethan Allen, supper, check. And then you have other names, ditto, ditto, ditto. So he was having dinner with some friends, some associates. And then you also see one bottle of wine. And there may be a couple of other drinks that were imbibed that night as well. But this gives you kind of first-hand, intimate insight into what it was like. These were real people. We tend to think of, you know, statistics. You know, 1,000 soldiers died in the Battle of Bennington. That's not the actual number, but you know, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of individual stories that we don't know a lot about. And so it's really exciting when we can bring something that tangibly connects us to that person. So this is a tin-type photograph. Tin-types were photographs that were printed on metal plates, tin plates of metal. They were very popular in America around the time of the Civil War, 1860s into the 1870s. And sometimes they were used to make copies of earlier handmade portraits. Of course, photography was introduced to America in 1939, or 1839, excuse me. And after that point, you know, little miniature portraits, watercolors on paper, as Jonathan Holton's portrait is, or on ivory, as some relatives and descendants of Ethan Allen, which are on view in the little exhibit, are on, because they were a little bit more well-to-do and could afford portraits on ivory. Then there are silhouettes. But by the time this was made, you know, some 40 years after Jonathan Holton had died, he had 13 children. And so they probably made copies of the portrait so that children or people in the family who wanted a copy but didn't actually hold the original could have an image of their descendant. And so this portrait came to the museum's collection in 1976. Allowed by centennial interest, people were thinking about the Revolutionary War, and luckily it came with a full identification of who this person was, the fact that he had fought in the Battle of Bennington, he had received a wound during the battle. It turns out we now have a description of it from the town history of the New Hampshire town that he came from, where it describes a musket ball going through his left cheek, almost ripping off his upper lip, and at the same time having buckshot going into his right cheek near his eye. And as you can kind of make out in this tin-type portrait, but can make out much better in the original portrait here on the right, you can see that wound. You can see the sacrifice that he made on that battlefield on that day on August 16th, 1777. And so I get cracked up sometimes. This is real people. And so it's amazing to be able to get that close and be able to see that image that was painted much later, probably about 1820 or shortly before he passed away in 1821. But you know, his wound was something that was important enough to record in the town history. It was something that mattered, and it's something that we still have a tangible link to today. But what is really exciting is how we discovered this portrait and who this person is. So we were given that tintype in 1976, and it sat in storage. It's not the most beautiful thing in the world. It's got some damage. It's a little hard to read. It's not big. So it spends most of its time in storage. I like it. I like 19th century folk art. I like early American portraits. And I like the idea that, you know, in the mid-19th century, people were taking photographs of them and passing them on and copying them in different ways. And so I shared this on Facebook. I have a lot of antique collectors and dealers and other curators that I'm friends with, and we share this kind of stuff to kind of, you know, see, what do you think? Isn't this interesting? And shortly after I shared this photograph of Lieutenant Jonathan Holton, I got an email from David Schorsch. And David Schorsch is one of the leading dealers in the country in early American antiques, folk art. He also happens to be one of the country, if not world's, leading collectors of mid-19th century photographic copies of earlier folk art. And that doesn't make him qualified, but or didn't give him insider knowledge. He just happened to say, here's a link to an eBay portrait you might be interested in. I had actually saved that eBay portrait in my likes and interests already, but it was completely unidentified. I didn't know who it was. I didn't know why he had a wound. Well, David said, look, it's the same one in your photograph of Lieutenant Jonathan Holton. It's the original portrait that's a copy of. And so through the magic of 21st century social media technology and a lot of luck, we were able to identify the original portrait that we had the copy of, and it entered into our collection through the generous donation of funds by David Schorsch and other members of our collection committee here at the Bennington Museum to actually acquire that original portrait. And so that's just a quick introduction to say, you know, there are still things to learn about the people that fought in the battle, and lessons to be learned from those histories that are now 250 years old. And I think it's really excited for me when I heard Phil's story that he had learned from Lyon Miles, who has been doing assiduous research on the Battle of Bennington for many, many decades. I got really excited because we are really committed here at the Bennington Museum to trying to tell the stories of as a diverse group of people as possible. And it's not always easy because Vermont has historically not been the most diverse place. But again, as I've said, individuals, when you look at the raw numbers, you know, it looks like small percentages, but each percentage point may be hundreds or thousands of real people. And so when he said that he had the story about Sipp Ives, who was a black man who fought with the Green Mountain Boys and sacrificed his life, I said, we need to hear that story. So without too much further ado, let me introduce you to our real presenters today. Following a career as a Navy and commercial airplane pilot and a master's in history from the University of Massachusetts, Lyon Miles has devoted himself to the study of the Battle of Bennington and other revolutionary subjects. He has made many presentations on the battle, including some to Bennington audiences in years past, as long ago as 1981 when he spoke at the rededication of the Common Grave Monument in the Old Bennington Cemetery. He has lectured on blacks in the Berkshires and a published authority on the Stockbridge Indians. He lives in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And Phil Holland first came to this area as a student at Bennington College, from which he graduated with a degree in literature and languages. He holds a PhD in English from the University of London, and after an academic career spent mostly in Greece, he returned to his home in Shaftesbury and has been turning his attention to local history. He is the author of Robert Frost in Bennington County and a guide to the Battle of Bennington and the Bennington Monument. And the subject of this presentation, as I've already alluded to, is Sipp Ives, a black Green Mountain Boy killed at the Battle of Bennington. Without further ado, let me welcome Phil Holland to the microphone.
Welcome, everyone. It's quite a turnout, and that's gratifying. Let me first explain what roles Lion Mile have played and are playing in this presentation. I'm responsible for the words of this talk, but I would have little to say without, I like Jamie's adjective, assiduous research by Lion Miles into the battle. You'll have a chance to hear his voice in the question period, when we also look forward to hearing your own. When Dina Mallory of the museum suggested a general title, New Finds About the Battle of Bennington, for these talks, I realized what an apt archaeological metaphor that made for the process of historical discovery that involves assembling fragments of the past, like potsherds. In the case of Sipp Ives, these fragments are all we have, out of which to assemble not a pot, but a whole person. All historical investigation requires evidence and imagination. We're going to present the evidence. It will be up to you to bring the imagination. This is the second day of Black History Month. There has been a Black History Month since 1976 by presidential proclamation. Before that, in 1926, Negro History Week was inaugurated by Carter Woodson and his association. And 71 years before that, in 1855, there was a remarkable book by a Black abolitionist, William C. Nell, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. It was the first attempt at a history of African Americans in the War for Independence. Technically, the second attempt because Nell had published a shorter book 4 years before. I'll show you the title page here. There it is. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the foreword, saying in part, "They fought for a land that had enslaved them, and whose laws, even in freedom, often are oppressed than protected." Nell told the stories of Crispus Attucks, Peter Salem, Agrippa Hull, of the Rhode Island Black Brigade, and David Humphrey's Connecticut Company, but also the stories of Mum Bet and Phyllis Wheatley, whose contributions to the Revolutionary era were not of a military nature. Jill Lepore has recently shown how America's reckoning with its Black population shaped the nation from its earliest years. And historians have now produced a number of well-researched studies of Blacks in the Revolution. But for all we know, there's a great deal that we don't. 18th century African Americans left behind few property deeds, or gravestones or other memorials, or even in many cases, their names, as these town records from Berkshire County, Massachusetts attest. A lot of blanks there, as you'll see. Military records, however, often have more to tell. And there are two principal kinds of military records for the Revolutionary War. One is the muster rolls. Although we know little about a man called Adam Negro, or another called Zephy Negro on the rolls, recorded at Bennington in 1778. They were members of Warner's regiment. Thanks to such rolls, we do know that such people did exist. Then there are the pension files. In 1818, the American government began to award pensions to Revolutionary era veterans on the basis of 3 years of service and financial need. And in 1832, they extended this to cover militia as well. These were not US Army, but state militias. And there you didn't have to demonstrate need, but of course you were already in your 70s or 80s. Nevertheless, people did apply for pensions. And under these two acts, 80,000 pension applications were filed, each consisting of multiple pieces of paper, of written testimony taken down under oath by court clerks. Historian John C. Dan has called this process one of the greatest oral histories ever undertaken. And let me just find my place here. He says, I want to quote him, that although the testimony of these veterans, they were in their latter years, He said that the war raised these men above ordinary existence and imprinted memories deeply in their minds, which you'll witness to today. These pension documents in the National Archives were microfilmed in the last century, and I say it with astonishment, are now digitized and searchable online. Lion Miles cranked the microfilm. I had the luxury of clicking and searching myself. Perhaps you've been researching your own ancestors in these files. I'm going to show you material from two files. Here is a page from the pension file of Pompey Woodward, who was 70 years old in 1832 when he made this declaration of service. Let's go, please. Nope. Excuse me, there we are. As you can see, he had a lot to say. And in the fair hand of the clerk, a little cramped towards the bottom, he recalls in brisk detail enlisting at Crown Point on Lake Champlain in 1776. He was 14 years old, Pompey Woodward was, when he enlisted. He was born in Shrewsbury, Mass, he says, had been living in the town of Bridport in Vermont, then the Hampshire Grants, of course. He recounts being inoculated for smallpox, recovering, then serving as an aide to a supply officer and helping rebuild Fort Ticonderoga, which, you recall, fell without a fight to the British forces under Burgoyne in July 1777. This map may help orient you. Those little explosions are battles. And you'll see Bennington in the lower right there. Following the evacuation of the fort, to continue on with his application, he records being in the advance at Hubbardton, and he may or may not have taken part in the bloody battle there, when the Americans were forced from the field and by German reinforcements. You recall that the British strategy was to cut the rebellious colonies in two by controlling the waterways from New York City to Montreal. Burgoyne had come down from Canada in the summer of '77 with 8,000 troops, half of them hired from various German princes, as well as some Canadians and 500 Indians. After Hubbardton, Woodward retreated with the Northern Army to Castleton, and a month later he was at Bennington at the time of the battle, though evidently he didn't fight in it. He saw the prisoners brought in, though, and serving as a guard, he witnessed a disturbance in the meeting house. There were 400 prisoners packed in there. A platform collapsed, some of them tried to break out and were shot. This is what he records. He remained at Bennington for 2 months until Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga. Then, in a skirmish, his commanding officer was captured, at which point he left the service. Years later, he applied for a pension, and he was awarded one, and so was his widow, his second wife, in 1853. And we know that Pompey Woodward was black through a reference in the file that he was a colored man. According to an early history of the town of Sullivan, New Hampshire, where he retired, he died a respectable Negro, and in the same source, we read that his wife insisted on having a respectable pew in the new church, which she obtained. In Pompey Woodward, then, we have one black life caught up in the Revolution and the aftermath of the Battle of Bennington, and one veteran able to enjoy the fruits of the Patriot victory. Now for the second file. The deponent is Daniel Brown, a former militia captain from Lanesboro, Mass. He was 90 years old when, in 1837, he made a statement in support of a pension application of Lucy Angel, widow of Abiathar Angel, a longtime resident of Pownell, Vermont, and a former captain in Seth Warner's Continental Regiment, known as the Green Mountain Boys, which fought at the Battle of Bennington. Daniel Brown evidently knew Abiathar Angel quite well. He had attended his wedding in the town of New Providence, a new settlement in the northern Berkshires, now Cheshire, in the summer of '77. and New Providence. There's just, yes, let's see here. This is Berkshire mess in the Berkshires in '76, some detail there, and further detail. Maybe that will orient you if you know where Lanesboro. You can see Adams at the top. That's where New Providence was. I'm going to go back because I want that one, actually. Brown also testified about Captain Angel's recruiting activities in 1777. Here's the relevant portion of the deposition. That's clear enough, isn't it? Well, that's what Lyon Miles patiently, assiduously read and understood when he did the research that sustains this presentation. I enhanced it a bit. There, that makes it a little easier, but not much. I'll read it for you, though. He, Abiathar Angel, was a continental captain in Colonel Seth Wardener's regiment for some time after. Then I think he was a recruiting captain until into the year 77, at or not, near the time of the Battle of Bennington, which was the 16th of August, 1777. I remember that after the Battle of Bennington, seeing a black man on the ground who was mortally wounded. This black man was enlisted by Captain Angel. Well, there's a clue. When Brown saw the wounded man, he realized that he knew him, although he doesn't recall his name for the deposition, and perhaps he never knew it. What we get from the deposition is a strong visual memory of the fallen black soldier, a memory that had stayed in Brown's mind for 70 years before emerging as anecdotal proof of Angel's service. Here's a muster roll from Captain Angel's company, 1777, June. There we go. From the pension files. 5 men. You can't see closely there. I'll give you a detail. There we are. 5 men are listed as having been recruited from New Providence, but only one of them, Private Sipp Ives, is named on 2 other documents as Sipp Ives, as having been killed at the Battle of Bennington. He was one among roughly 30 patriots who died at the battle, and his death is recorded on this return. Trust me, it's there, and on this return. There's the detail. Killed at the Battle of Bennington is the right-hand column. Sipp Ives, the 4th named. Here's a payroll record. It took 3 years to issue it, and obviously nothing was paid to Sipp Ives, but bureaucracy marched on, and it shows how much he spent for supplies and other details, and what he was paid. None of the 100 or perhaps 130 other men that Colonel Seth Warner led into battle on August 16th was reported killed. So I think we can say without a doubt that Sipp Ives was the mortally wounded black man seen by Daniel Brown, and who is marked as having died on August 17th, the day after the battle. Even without Brown's testimony, we could have surmised that Sipp Ives was black, as the DAR did in its 2008 listing of African-American patriots. Sipp's first name gives him away, as it did Pompey Woodward. Sipp, or Sippo, is from Scipio, that is, Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who defeated Hannibal in North Africa in the 3rd century BCE. It was a common black name in the 18th century, along with those of other leaders of the Roman Republic, like Caesar and Pompey and Cato. The name Sipp has a later history too, I think. This is my own surmise, and even shows up slightly altered in the Walt Disney song Zip-a-dee-doo-dah, which is based on an old minstrel song. As for the surname Ives, it's an old English name. Sipp Ives, or his New World forebears, must have taken or been given the family name of a slave owner or employer. But who was he? Where did he come from, and how did he come to die at the Battle of Bennington? There are only a few things we can say with certainty, so we have to turn largely to circumstantial evidence. For example, we know quite a lot about New Providence, the town from which Sipp Ives was recruited. Like Bennington, New Providence was founded by a religious splinter group. In the case of Bennington, it was New Light Congregational Separatists. New Providence was settled by Baptists from Rhode Island. The site they chose in 1767 was a hilltop in what is now part of Cheshire. They probably chose it not only for its defensive advantages, but also for its attractions as a city that is set on a hill. Perhaps you recognize that phrase from John Winthrop's sermon on the Arabella. It's resonated in American history. Reagan used to quote it, Obama quoted it. Winthrop was the early leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I was a little surprised, though, to learn in 1645 that his brother-in-law had said, you know, for this colony to thrive, and I'm quoting, it won't thrive unless we get in a stock of slaves to do our business, which they did get in. When Julius Vosmus, the Brunswick surgeon who was captured at the Battle of Bennington, was passing through Williamstown on his prisoner's march, he remarked that at most houses one saw black slaves and many children. We know that New Providence had at least 4 enslaved people, according to an early town history. It was also a town that strongly favored independence and sent 85 men in militia groups to various alarms, including to the Battle of Bennington. One of the men that led one of those companies was a man named Job Safford, whose gravestone is in the monument at New Providence, now Cheshire, that still exists. There's the memorial, and there's his gravestone. The fine print says, who fought and bled at the Battle of Bennington. He was wounded but lived to tell the tale, which is well known to historians. We don't know when Sipp Ives arrived in New Providence or under what circumstances. We don't know his place of birth or who his parents were. We can assume that in the not very distant past, 1, 2, 3 generations, in any case, since the early 17th century, his ancestors had been brought from Africa as slaves. He could have been enslaved himself, or he could have been a free man and served a particular family as a household servant or laborer. He owned no property himself, it seems. And he'd be invisible to history, I think, if he had not enlisted in Warner's regiment in 1777, which he could have done on his own or at the bidding of his master. A German officer traveling through the western Berkshires that winter recorded that a slave could take the field in his master's place. Hence, you never see a regiment in which there are not Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them. If enslaved, he could have been promised his freedom if he enlisted, and if free, the promise of monthly wages of 40 shillings or £2 might have been an inducement. It's most likely that, like the majority of settlers in New Providence, he was from Rhode Island. Rhode Island had the highest percentage of blacks in New England in the 1770s, about 6% of the population there, enslaved and free. Many blacks worked in the ports as laborers and artisans, while others toiled in Rhode Island fields. One of those ports, of course, was Newport, which was one of the centers of the American slave trade, which played, as you may know or may not know, an essential role in New England's colonial economy. There was no one else in New Providence by the name of Ives, although there were some other Iveses elsewhere in the Berkshires and Rhode Island and Connecticut, but none with an obvious connection to Sipp. He wasn't the only black recruit from New Providence, though. Let's go back to Angel's muster roll. There you see a few other names. Simeon Grandison, Charles Grandison. Well, it seems that Simeon, who enlisted the same day as Sipp, was also colored, as an early town history of Scituate, Massachusetts terms him. That's where he retired. That's where he filed his pension return from. He died there in 1835 at the age of 89, having been awarded a pension on the basis of 3 years of service. And if he was black, surely Charles Grandison, probably a brother, was black also. And perhaps Jonathan Grumman, or even John Whiting. It was Angel's job to recruit all the able-bodied men he could, whatever their color or status, and he drew heavily from his own town. By the year 1777, blacks were permitted to serve in both the Continental Army and the Massachusetts Militia. That represented a change in initial policy in both cases, driven by the need for men. But blacks, like whites, had a choice to make. When the Revolution came, as historian Gary Nash has written, African Americans reached a crossroads, with one large contingent casting their lot with the British, and the others hoping against hope that white Americans would honor their founding principles by making all men free and equal. The large contingent, more than 20,000 men, who escaped to British lines and who were promised freedom in return for allegiance to the crown, were mostly slaves from Virginia and other southern states. A lesser number of Americans, 5,000 is the usual estimate, enslaved and free, fought as patriots. At the outset of the war in 1775, free black soldiers were fighting side by side with whites at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. But Congress soon forbade the enlistment of strollers, Negroes, and vagabonds. As the order put it, some Continental leaders feared that arming blacks would lead to slave insurrections. George Washington and other commanders soon changed their minds, and Congress's mind, as they faced the realities of making war with limited manpower, and as they witnessed black courage in battle. As the war wore on, state and continental forces increasingly turned to blacks, free and enslaved, to fill the ranks. The result was the most integrated U.S. Army until the Korean War. In Massachusetts Bay, blacks made up only 2% of the population at the time of the Revolution. Some of them, 216 of them, according to one census of the time, had already come to the Berkshires, a frontier region where there was a town, Stockbridge, that was still majority Indian, though the Indians were in the process of being displaced. That's where a man named Agrippa Hull grew up in a free black family. That's his portrait in the Stockbridge Library. He became an attendant and messenger for two commanders, one of them the Polish patriot and engineer, Tadeusz Kosciusko. Hull returned to Stockbridge after the war, becoming a prominent citizen of the town. The irony, let's call it that, of a nation in which most blacks were enslaved, using black soldiers to fight a war for liberty, was not lost on everyone. When a fellow delegate to Congress from Virginia floated the idea of paying a bounty in Negroes to promote white enlistment, James Madison replied, "Would it not be as well to liberate and make soldiers at once of the blacks themselves?" It would certainly be more consonant to the principles of liberty, which ought not to be lost sight of in a contest for liberty. But perhaps we shouldn't let Madison have the last word. Slaveholding Madison, author of the Three-Fifths Clause. I like Samuel Johnson's retort, 1775. Ever seen that one? How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes, as of course most of our founding fathers were? Not all, but most. The 1770s called the question, and not just for blacks as soldiers. The national government tragically failed to put its declared principles into law in the matter of slavery, but some state governments did away with it. Led by Vermont, which was not yet a state in its 1777 Constitution. In Vermont's case, though, it was only adult slavery that was not permitted, and the law was not always obeyed, as we have recently been told by Harvey Amani Whitfield of UVM. He wrote a book and gave a lecture. In 1786, they had to repeat the instruction. There were slaves still being used in Vermont until that date. Massachusetts courts effectively retired slavery in 1781 in the face of legal challenges, such as the previously mentioned Mumbet of Stockbridge, who cited the words of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution in her suit, won her freedom, and became Elizabeth Freeman. Now back to Sipp Ives. Although we know little of him before he enlists, once he joins Warner's regiment, we can track his general movements. And I want to be careful with the use of this term, Green Mountain Boys. It's a resonant term in Vermont. It seems that it was first used around 1770 by Ethan Allen and his associates, including Seth Warner, as the name for the group that defended New Hampshire land titles against competing land title grants from New York. The boys were an unofficial citizen militia, and in New York they were called the Bennington Mob. While they contended as best they could in the courts of New York, they also worked by intimidation, beatings, destruction of property. But the outbreak of hostilities in Massachusetts in April '75 led the boys to turn their efforts from property disputes with New York to war against the British, when Ethan Allen led a group of Green Mountain Boys and militiamen from Massachusetts and Connecticut in a surprise capture of Fort Ticonderoga, and Seth Warner took Crown Point. The boys found a new purpose and fame. The men needed to be paid, so Allen and Warner traveled to Philadelphia to request that Congress authorize their troops as a regiment for the newly formed Continental Army, with a view to an invasion of Canada. Congress agreed and asked New York to put up the money. New York held its nose. Some of its members had voted to put a price on Allen's and Warner's heads the year before, but they agreed under the new circumstances. And when representatives of the grants met in July of '75 to select officers for the new regiment, they chose not Allen but Warner as the commander by a wide margin. When the Continental Army was reorganized in 1776, the regiment was known officially as Warner's Extra Continental Regiment, and informally as the Green Mountain Boys. General Philip Schuyler, commander of the Northern Army, consistently calls the regiment the Green Mountain Boys in his correspondence. Historians have used it, and do use the name to refer to Warner's regiment. Governor Scott, 2 years ago, on Battle Day here at Bennington, used it himself. Ethan Allen was a British prisoner at the time of the battle. Sipp Ives enlisted as part of a recruiting push in early 1777 as plans for the British invasion from Canada were taking shape in London. Fort Ticonderoga, which Sipp Ives, like Pompey Woodward, probably worked to fortify, was to be the bulwark that would protect New England and the Hudson Valley. After it fell, Warner's regiment took heavy losses at Hubbardton. With the pursuing British forces pausing in Castleton, Schuyler ordered Warner to patrol the dangerous area to the north of Manchester, to deprive Burgoyne of the cattle and other supplies that he needed for his army. Thomas Mellon of New Hampshire, whom we'll hear from again on the battlefield, described his patrol as living like lords on pigs and chickens in the houses of the Tories who had fled. On August 7th, General Stark arrived in Manchester with his New Hampshire militia, and conferred with Warner, who went with him to Bennington, leaving command of his own troops in the hands of Samuel Safford. As soon as it became clear on the morning of the 14th that a British force was advancing on Bennington, Warner sent word to his regiment to come down immediately from Manchester. But it took a day for those out on scout to return and for his force to be assembled. They began to march on the morning of the 15th, Sipp Ives, no doubt, among them. It rained hard. The men marched through mud till midnight and camped a mile north of Bennington. They spent the morning of the 16th drying out their ammunition, drying out their muskets, and passing through Bennington for ammunition. They were somewhere between Bennington and the battlefield, 7 miles west of Bennington, when fighting began around 3 p.m. They stopped at Stark's camp to refresh themselves with a ration of rum and water. When you think about it, there was a black presence in the rum, too. Where did it come from? Molasses, distilled in New England, but created by slave labor in the West Indies. Meanwhile, Stark's forces, made up of militia from Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and a few men from New York, had overwhelmed the combined German, British, Indian, and Loyalist forces entrenched against them. The battle seemed to be over. Men scattered, and prisoners by the hundred were marched off to Bennington. Then the German reinforcements arrived, 656 of them under Colonel Breyman, with 2 6-pound cannons, clearing the way with grape shot. Soon the Americans were retreating before them. Outnumbered, they made a stand near Hathaway's Drive-In, which didn't exist at the time. If it helps you get your bearings. You can see this map on the battlefield itself, the battlefield park. And, well, there's the blue are US troops, and the red, the advancing British-German. You see where they first face off on the left, that's Hathaway's, and then a second stand where it says Walloomsac. There's a marker there now. This was what we call the second engagement. Let's let Thomas Mellon tell the story, as he did to James Davy Butler in 1848, when Mellon was a very lively 92. He's just run into Breyman's column. We skirmishers ran back till we met a large body of Stark's men and faced about, but the enemy outflanked us, and I said to a comrade, "We must run or they will have us." "I will have one more fire first," he said. At that moment, a major on a black horse, this was Major John Rand of Worcester, Mass., ran behind us, shouting, "Fight on, boys, reinforcements close by." In 5 minutes, we saw Seth Warner's men hurrying to help us. One half of them attacked each flank of the enemy and beat back those who were just closing around us. Stark's men now took heart and stood their ground. Compare David Holbrook's account of the same scene. Holbrook was only 17 at the time, but his memory, at age 72 in 1832, seems almost photographic. The firing there continued for some time without cessation, when Colonel Warner with the remains of his regiment came up. The battle then became desperate, and immediately I heard a tremendous crash up in the woods at the right of the American troops. That was Warner's men firing one of the captured German cannon, which was seconded by the most terrible yell that ever I heard. Then I heard the voice of Colonel Warner like thunder, saying, "Fix bayonets, charge." Then the old man on the stump, this is Major Rand again, cried out, "Charge, boys," and jumped from the stump and ran towards the enemy. His men, some with and some without bayonets, followed suit and rushed upon the enemy with all their might, who, seeing us coming, took to their heels and were completely routed. You recognize Seth Warner. Other accounts, including General Stark's, corroborate this general picture of the arrival of Warner's men. It was during this desperate fighting, the hottest of the day by many accounts, the fighting that sealed the Patriots' victory, that Sipp Ives is most likely to have been mortally wounded. Now I saw what effect our cannon and musket fire had had, wrote the German surgeon Wasmus in his journal as he recalled the Patriot dead and wounded from the first engagement. Sipp Ives is listed as having died on the 17th, the day after the battle. Many wounded men remained on the battlefield all night long. It's likely that Ives was buried on the battlefield on the 17th. Surgeon Wasmus recorded that at Stockbridge, through which he was being marched 9 days later, 1,000 riflemen came through here today, who together with many savages and blacks were going to General Gates's army. Those men were part of the surge of militia on their way to put a stop to Burgoyne's advance in the wake of the victory at Bennington. More than 17,000 Americans would force Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga by mid-October. Burgoyne's defeat, the alliance with France, the course of world history, if you like, flowed from the Patriot victory at Bennington. I want to conclude by showing you a painting. It shows, among other things, a black man, or boy, conducting prisoners after the battle. You may have seen him. The painting is right downstairs. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. White artist, white speaker, bear with me and tell me what you think. The scene is right here in Old Bennington. There are 5 mounted figures. On the left, in green coats, are Vermont's Colonels Warner and Herrick. Then, raising an arm in the center background, is one of the Stockbridge Indians. They weren't at the battle, in fact, but he's serving as a guard. They were allied with the Patriots. Then you see General Stark with saber aloft. And lastly, I'll blow this up in a moment, in the shadows, but at the same height and on the same scale as the officers, is a splendidly attired young African-American leading tied-up Tories as prisoners. Leroy Williams had several secondary sources available for this figure, including Nell's Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. There we read that it was Mrs. Moses Robinson, wife of the Bennington militia colonel, who requested that her Negro man lead the prisoners on her mare, or she wouldn't allow the ropes that sustained her beds to be used to tie the prisoners. That would account for the fine clothes befitting a servant, or more likely a slave, in a wealthy household. But did the incident really occur? I put the question to Mr. Miles. You can't read the fine print of the pension declaration of David Nichols from Holden, Mass., made in 1832. There's the relevant portion. I'll read it for you. He recounts that after scouting duties, he arrived in Bennington the day after the battle and assisted in guarding the prisoners, and that while there, he saw 60 Tories who had been taken, tied together in pairs, and led away by a Negro. So Williams' painting is historically accurate, though accurate is, of course, not the right word for a work of art. None of the 19th century accounts says explicitly what is meant by having a Negro lead the procession of prisoners, but I take it as a ritual humiliation designed to show the Tories and all comers that the political order has been turned upside down. I also think that the dashing, jubilant figure of the young black man astride the horse is claiming a share in the day's triumph and looking forward to the triumph of freedom, perhaps including his own freedom in America in years to come. That brings us back to Sipp Ives, who didn't get to celebrate the Patriot victory or live out his years in the country he helped forge from the battlefield. All we can do for him now is simply to remember that among the patriots who fought and died for American independence in the Battle of Bennington was a black man, Sipp Ives, from Warner's regiment of Green Mountain Boys, The role of Patriot Battle Dead in the Bennington Museum Library now includes his name. That's it. We can all take some questions, and we can hear Lion Miles's voice if we turn on his little equipment there. Let me do that for you, Lion. Say something for us.
Great. I'm glad to be turned on.
But, so we are opening it up to questions. Obviously, Phil, Ryan, myself, any question relating to Sipp Ives, the role of blacks in the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Bennington,
or comments as well.
Or comments, input, anything. Yes.
Who was Leroy Williams? What's his background? And when he painted this, was it a splash of history made? Or
so, yeah, I can tell you a lot about. Yeah, so the question is, who was Leroy Williams, and the painting of this painting, kind of the context, the larger context for it. And so for those of you who were able to see our summer exhibition last summer, which was on the WPA and the New Deal at large in the state of Vermont, we showed some of the studies for this, a letter between our founding director, John Spargo, and Leroy Williams, and we have a file that's about this thick of correspondence between Spargo, Leroy Williams, with various museum curators, about Native American garbs, the Stockbridge Indians who Phil mentioned. We have, they went through great depth to try and be historically accurate, as we heard today, in many cases were. I mean, there's obviously artistic license being taken, it's a grand composition, you gotta get every important figure in there, and the fact that, you know, this African American, and what is his name? Do we know? Yes. The African American.
We do not know.
We do not know his name. But we do know that he was there, and that Leroy Williams chose to put him on a horse and make him a prominent figure in the composition.
Probably on the basis of William C. Nell's book, because this is, I think it's the costume that would befit a servant or slave in a wealthy family, and that's evidently what the anecdote that is recorded by an antiquarian by the name of Henry Stevens. He was Nell's servant.
So this large portrait was the largest painting that was a collaboration between the museum and the Works Progress Administration. And so there was a Vermont State Works Progress Administration office up in Burlington run by a man named Pierre Zwicky. There were various artists that were working in the state of Vermont as artists, and a number of them got connected to the Bennington Museum, who was one of the prominent historical institutions in Vermont at the time. We had been founded here on this site in the original church wing of the building in 1928. So we were in our infancy, a little over a decade old, and we worked with these artists to create paintings of important events in Bennington history. Interestingly, another one of the paintings, or two of the paintings that were created, were of names often escape me, and I should have been thinking about this coming into this. The black preacher, Lemuel Haynes, thank you very much. Lemuel Haynes, who was a preacher who worked the circuit out of Granville and Rutland, New York and Rutland, Vermont. He preached at the Old First Church. We have a large-scale mural of him in the church gallery, not the church that he preached in, that wasn't built, but the Old First Church just up the hill, as well as a portrait of him sitting, a formal portrait of him, based on, again, Leroy Williams's research into, he did have images of him made during his life, so we have a decent idea of what he looked like. And so these were portraits that were created to record important moments in Vermont history through the WPA, and they did lots of research to try and get it as right as possible. So why was John Spargo, Leroy Williams, and other artists Schwartz is actually the artist of the large mural, and there's another artist who did the portrait of Lemuel Haynes. There was clearly an interest in black contributions to Vermont history, Revolutionary War history here at Bennington. There was a beautiful letter from I'm forgetting the name of there was a group of cultural figures in I believe out of Harlem, who actually wrote a letter to John Spargo thanking him for profiling these important African-American figures in history and helping make sure that their contributions to American history are remembered in perpetuity. So that's a long way of describing. I don't know why Spargo and his personal, political, and other views are really complex, and I, in 13 years, still haven't gotten to the bottom of them. But they did make these contributions at that time for whatever reason. We don't have real evidence of why those decisions were made. Yes?
I'd like to hear from Mr. Miles about his research into Sipp Ives.
Yeah, Lion, your own research into Sipp Ives, how did you become interested? How did you discover this?
Well, I spent a lot of time going through the pension files of the 80,000 Americans who were in the Revolution. And I came across this one statement that says, I saw a black man mortally wounded on the ground. So I told Phil about that, and he got very excited. At the time, I didn't think much about it, and just another man who was wounded. But a black man makes it distinct. And from there, Phil has taken off, and we've tried very diligently to identify the man, but we haven't really been successful yet.
We've identified him, but we don't know as much as we'd like to know about him.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know enough about him. We don't know whether he was a slave or a free man, whether his owner, if he was a slave, whether he gave him permission to join the army. We don't know much about him, but he's there, and we, thanks to Phil, will soon find out. I'm sure we'll find out all about it.
And our lack of knowledge is part of the story, in my view. The fact that we don't have a complete portrait through the fragments is characteristic of black lives in the 18th century. The truth is we know more about him and about other Revolutionary War servicemen than we do the majority of blacks who were alive at that time in America.
I would, excuse me, go ahead.
No, please ask your question.
Oh, thank you. Knowing from what you've said and what both of you found that there were some black Americans who served, who were successful in obtaining pensions, what about then, what about Stockbridge Indians who also were involved in this conflict? Were any of them awarded pensions?
There were a few, only a very few.
Lyon, let me repeat the question for people.
Yes, we're off on Indians.
It's a good question. Okay, what about the Stockbridge Indians who served? Did they qualify for pensions? And did they serve? Lyon, why don't you address that one?
Yes, they did serve. They served as scouts before Bennington, and they were instrumental in capturing a lot of British soldiers. Their Indians are brought in. Burgoyne had his own Indians, but the Stockbridge Indians rallied to join the American Army. And some of them did get pensions later. That answers your question, but I don't know much more than that.
There were other Indian allies of the American forces. I think the Tuscarora, for instance. The revolution divided Indian country between British and American interests.
Of course, those Tuscaroras, that's a distinct, these are Iroquois tribes. And they did indeed serve in the American Army too. Some of them got pensions as well.
Really? You were telling us over lunch, Lyon, about the fate of the Stockbridge Indians. Where are they now? Are there any left anywhere?
Yes, there are a lot of them left, and they live in Wisconsin, and they're good friends of mine, and I used to go every year in August to their powwows. And they allowed me to carry I was in the Navy, and they allowed me to carry the Navy flag at their powwows. I consider that a great honor, but they're wonderful people. They're very proud of their heritage here. There are people still who live through the Berkshires and this part of the world that claim descendant from them. They didn't all move, but 300 of them moved to New York State in 1785. And they were cheated out of their land there, just as they were here. And they decided they didn't want to live in New York, and they moved, and they found land in Wisconsin, and that's where they are today. That's a different story, a remarkable story, but what can I say?
Yeah, that's what we wanted to know.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. I should say about the Battle of Bennington, there were many of the German soldiers were severely wounded, and they were brought into the meeting house, which is now was then the Walloon-Sack meeting house, and they brought doctors up from New York. General Gates sent American doctors to treat them. It was horrible. Now, the state of medicine at that time was pretty sad. All they knew how to do was cut arms and legs off, which indeed is what they say in the letters. They cut and they sticked and they took arms and legs off. So much so that one of the doctors said, he quoted from Virgil, he quoted Latin, wrote in his letter in Latin, "My hair stood on end and my voice caught in my throat." To me, that's so dramatic of the horrors after the battle. And many of these Germans died here, which you'll see their names in the marker in the town hall, not town hall.
In the Bennington Center.
Oh, he's got it, well, yeah, in the
common grave.
Across, next to the meeting house in the center of Bennington. Yes.
Yep.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, please.
I'm sorry to be so ignorant. I'm from Brattleboro.
Glad you're here. She's from Brattleboro.
Yeah, right. It's nice in Brattleboro, by the way.
I don't know how many people fought on each side in the Battle of Bennington, how many were wounded, how many actually died.
The question is really how many people fought
Oh.
at Bennington? How many were
Oh
wounded?
boy,
How many died?
that's a great question. I was prepared for that. The standard histories say that Vermonters rallied to the battle. But in fact, the research I've done shows that mostly they were Massachusetts militia. Obviously, Berkshire County was the next, right around the corner. So that the battle was really overrun by the Germans, overrun by the militiamen from Massachusetts, a few from Vermont, very few from New York State. The settlers in New York were fleeing south to Williamstown. They didn't stop to fight, even though there was a regiment there. It's a very complex array. Think of the mass of confusion at the time. Suddenly they've got all these German soldiers marching on them, and they're trying to rally themselves to fight these Germans.
Yeah, there were about, what, maybe 1,300 Germans, their loyalist friends, versus perhaps 2,200 to 3,000
There you go. It would, the victory was won mostly by Massachusetts militia. Secondly, by the fact that they overran the Germans. If the second expedition under Brymon with 2 cannons had arrived in time with the 2 cannons that Baum had, they very well could have won the victory. 4 cannons against the militia. It would have been no contest. The hero of the battle, I've got to tell you this, is not Colonel Warner, in my opinion. It's Colonel John Rand, Major John Rand at the time, who came from Worcester County. He was a Worcester innkeeper. He was 54 years old. Yet this guy, he's been totally ignored by all the histories. He rode, when the second engagement arrived, when the Germans arrived, he rode with he had 90 Berkshire County militia with him. He rode to the battle and he tried to hold them off. They shot, there several counts of, his horse was shot in his neck and his rump. But the major held on until Warner's men came up and defeated the Germans. The Germans ran out of ammunition, as a matter of fact. But in the meantime, old Major Rand, he's given no record of this. There should be a statue of the guy if we knew what he looked like. He later was promoted to colonel. He served in the fort at West Point, and he died. We have no record of his life after that. He was 54 years old in the battle. In those days, 54 was an old man. And anyway, I'm glad I got my plug in for John Rand.
Well, you notice that his name came up twice in those first-hand accounts as holding the line
Yes.
for Warner. So
It's fully
been
documented.
forgotten.
But I have this wonderful account how Warner arrived at the battle and says, where's the front here, Major Rand? And Rand said, there is no front here, it's all front. And they've shot me and my horse in my head and his rump. And it's all battle here. Help!
Do you get a pension?
No, he died too soon.
I'm sorry to throw that in. It has nothing to do with the blacks, but I thought I'd tell you that. It's a wonderful battle. This is a fantastic battle which has been so poorly reported in the histories consistently from the beginning. Almost every fact of the battle is wrong, or it should be elaborated upon. It's an important battle because it's the first time Burgoyne's army was stopped. It was the first check to Burgoyne's army. And it's an accidental battle. Militiamen from all over Massachusetts and Connecticut were pouring into here. Baum was coming down with the Germans, thinking he was going to capture the storehouse. What he found was there wasn't much of a storehouse, but there were a lot of militia here. Neither side knew that the other one was here. It's incredible. Incredible battle in our history. The great historian John Keegan calls it the Battle of Barrington. That shows you how little people know about what happened.
You know, it's interesting. One of my favorite experiences here at the museum was in 2011 when we were celebrating the 250th anniversary of settlement. I was able to work on an exhibition that brought together some of the important early documents and archival records of Bennington's early settlement, including a section in the exhibition on the Battle of Bennington. And for me, it's amazing how much we do have and do know. I mean, it takes a lot of digging in pension records, you know, and trust me, doing that is not easy or fun work, trying to transcribe those things, so it's incredible. But it's also, you know, it's the bits, why certain bits and pieces get handed down. And, you know, two of the most beautiful things related to the Battle of Bennington in our collection at the museum, which don't go on regular view because they're original handwritten documents from the 18th century, are two handwritten first-hand accounts of the Battle of Bennington, written within a day or two of the battle by Rudd and Peter Clark, who were, Rudd was from, I believe, New York State, but nearby here, and Peter Clark was from New Hampshire. But, you know, it's the bits and pieces and how they get handed down and how they get preserved, and it's important that we continue kind of digging up these new histories, like the histories of Sipp Ives and the Black Man on the Horse in the Leroy Williams painting, so that we continue to understand the full contributions of, you know, you can never know each individual story, but the more individual stories that you know, the better you understand the big picture.
Yeah, well said.
Way in the back, we have a question. Yes, please. And you can, let me see if I can hear you.
No.
I grew up here in Bennington my whole entire life, and I have always been the minority in the room. So I have
I'll
to say
repeat
that
what you
this
say, so don't
Yes.
worry about it.
This is very nice to have someone to relate to, almost a superhero type.
Would you like to step this way forward so we could all hear you and see who is speaking to us, if you don't mind?
Okay. Sorry.
Come on up.
Come on, BJ.
I guess we were thinking the same. That's my daughter.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Sorry. So I was just saying that I grew up here in Bennington, Vermont, And I was always the minority in the room, still typically always the minority in the room, whether it be school or work or at public speeches or groups like this. And I know that everybody wants someone to relate to, and this is really nice growing up here, now feeling like I have someone I can relate to. I went to Catholic school here, and my children also go to school here, and I've never heard this version before, so it's really nice. And I'm wondering if you think that this will be incorporated into the Vermont curriculum now, as a new finding, you know, changing the view on the Battle of Bennington and education.
Yeah, thanks very much for speaking. Would you like to say anything, sir?
I was about to say to some, I'm Leon Johnson. I'm Leon Johnson, and that's my daughter, Patricia Johnson, and it's true. I've been here 41 years in Bennington, came up from Birmingham, Alabama, and we've just about been the only African Americans or people of color in mostly everything we participate in. But I want to make a comment. You did a splendid job here in terms of detailing the information and putting together to make a real true believer out of the history itself. It's not an easy job to do this. It's not something easy to find and discover. And on the second part of that, everybody wants to know something about their history or their past or the participation, so that when I said something to my daughter and my son, and now she said to the grandkids and so forth, we had a part in this as a person of color, had something to do with the Battle of Bennington, and we need to know that. When we read it in the classrooms and so forth, you can say, I know something about that. Now that's different. And so I wanted to really express my appreciation and thanks for all your efforts for Phil and Miles for doing this.
Thanks very much for those words, Leon. I'm so glad it was meaningful for you, and we'll try to make it meaningful for school groups too. You know, we are trying to bring the Battle of Bennington into the schools. We had a special program, federally funded last year, a local heritage grant, and that's going to be a continuing process in the schools. And as we learn more things, we will enrich the curriculum still further, and I think it's important that we make it as inclusive and historically accurate as we can. So we'll take care of that.
I'd also just add to that the museum is very committed to bringing out the diversity of views and people who have participated in our history. And so one of our major exhibitions coming up this summer is on the 1960s in Vermont, Fields of Change on the 1960s in Vermont. And there will be information and documentation of the civil rights movement here in Bennington, Vermont. There were lunch counter sit-ins right on Main Street at Walgreens in the 1960s. And we're going to be continuing to delve into these little-known and unknown histories that give a better sense of what was happening for everybody in Bennington moving forward.
May I add, the black participation here was important. Sipp Ives was not the first black man at the battle. There were others. We have their names, we know nothing about them. But research will prove, I hope, that there was black participation here, as in all battles of the Revolution. But important here, equally as the rest of the war.
Thanks. Another question back there. Yes, please.
No, there's enough here for a book. When's it come?
He wants me to write another book. Well, I want Lion to write that book, but I don't know about that. But this is the first step, and we've ended up stepping further than I would have imagined at first. I must say, as I think I told the Bennington Banner, it's for me been a process of self-education for me. There's a lot out there on this subject that is fascinating and very telling about American history that I didn't learn in school, and we'll try to change that for the next generation.
If you haven't written the book yet, have you written an article?
Yeah, we'll see about that. This is something that could be put into that form, yes.
I'm sure the Williamsack Review would welcome you. Both of you.
I see the editor in the back trying to give me a hard stare. Yes, please.
Many of you checked out the library in Arlington, Vermont. They have a section that goes way back in the 1600s, 1700s.
A question, have we checked out the library in Arlington? They have a section that goes back into the 18th century. And, you know, local libraries are a valuable source. Town histories are a very valuable source. Sometimes it's anecdotal, but fortunately, and this is an amazing thing, I referred to the town history of Scituate, Mass. And Sullivan, New Hampshire. Where did I find those? Archive.com. They're right there, just Google them, and suddenly you're reading books from 1829 online.
I have a first-hand remark from a neighbor when we first moved to Vermont in 1987. She was still 80, 90 years old. But she spoke about Dr. Russell in Arlington, who was a self-made historian. And she said he was in all the old-timers' attics minutes before they gasped their last breath. And he had the rights to all these people who really collect.
Yeah, the importance of, she's remarking on how archives are collected, and from the attics of the older people in your towns.
And this is called the Russell Collection.
The Russell Collection in Arlington, yeah. Many towns have such collections.
And I'll say, though, there is greater and greater access to this material out there, and you know, our museum is taking steps to try and make as much of our collections. We still have material in our libraries and in our archives that are not available online, though, you know, it was through online research by our collections manager, Callie Raspusi, who put together the installation with the Jonathan Holden portrait, that she came across the town history that told us exactly verbatim the musket ball going through his cheek. So there is resources in libraries and our library and archives here at the museum that are not available online, but you know, so continue to use those local resources, and we will continue working to try and make them as accessible as possible. And I think we probably should wrap it up. One more question?
Bennington, Arlington, Hoosick Falls, all back in the 1800s. There are glass plates. I have been trying to locate them in here. They were donated to the Bennington Museum. You would get a lot of history out of that.
Well, we actually have our entire glass plate negative collection scanned and online. So all of that information, all of those images are available online. There's still lots of research and individual documentation to be done, but the images themselves, the core kind of value that they have as images that allow us to do the research is all available on our website. Yes, you can all go online to our collection online and do keyword searches, town searches, and you will get hundreds and hundreds of images. It's something like 10 to 12,000 glass plate negatives have been scanned and digitized in the last 10 years, and are all available now as of about 2 years ago. When was this? In the 80s. Well, leave your information either with me or with somebody at the front desk, and I will get in touch with you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody.